Good evening, everybody, and Happy New Year. Hope you feel the first 30 days were well worth the wait for this presentation this evening. I'm excited to introduce you to Emma. She's a raptor biologist from Fort Collins, which, as a new resident to Colorado, I call the Great North, with a Bachelor's of Science in Conservation Biology from CSU. That's that school in Fort Collins, the Rams, I believe. You studied as a graduate student for Ferruginous Hawks, and we were lucky enough to volunteer in the field for a month post-graduation. I know a lot of folks are always looking for jobs, so I'm glad you got busy right after walking the stage, walking right out into the field. And then from that moment, she's been hooked on raptors. Maybe you listen to hip hop, but you've been hooked on raptors ever since, and you have done five Hawkwatch seasons in Minnesota, New Mexico, and Colorado at Dinosaur Ridge. That's a lot of time in the sun. I hope you have some sunscreen recommendations. Emma is excited for her fourth season as a counter at Dinosaur Ridge and her first year as the project lead. Congratulations on the promotion. Let's make some noise for Emma.
Yeah, as Taiki said, I'm Emma Riley. This is my fourth season with Dinosaur Ridge. My first season as the project lead. I'm super excited to be coming on as the project lead. We just hired our other counter for the season, which is really exciting. And she's one of our previous observers from last year. So it's really cool to see people coming back that just had, a weekend day to come and count with us that want to come back and join for the season. So we're really excited. And yeah, our site is located at Dinosaur Ridge. Some of you may be familiar with the fossil site. It's along that same ridge. I think there's something to be said for raptor migration occurring at a historic fossil site, but that's a presentation for another time. But this site, we can see red rocks right across the street. It's a little over a half-mile hike up, and yeah, this picture is a picture of me deep in looking at a bird, probably a couple miles away along the western Morrison, Mount Morrison in the distance. So tonight, just to go over a little bit of an overview of what we'll be doing, I'm going to cover just a grander history of raptor conservation and then some hawk watching history. And then I'll get into the history of Dinosaur Ridge, look at past and present data from Dinosaur Ridge, and then kind of touch on how to get involved if this is something that seems interesting to you. This picture right here was taken by a volunteer at the end of the season last year. I have been fighting tooth and nail to get an amazing look at an adult goshawk. And on the last day of the season, this bird came by and I shed a tear over it. But so I wanted to include that picture. I think it's an amazing photo. So good job, Chris. Okay, so to get started, it's kind of tough to pick where in history I want to start with raptor conservation because raptors have been an important part of ancient civilization since we've been able to find drawings and writings of any peoples on this land. But I thought it would be a good place to start with a letter from Benjamin Franklin that he wrote his daughter in 1784 after receiving a medal in the Revolutionary War with a bald eagle emblem on it. And he states, he is a bird of bad moral character. He does not get his living honestly. He is there by no means a proper emblem for the brave and honest who have driven all of the kingbirds from our country. So making a really interesting comparison between the bald eagle and those who fought in the Revolutionary War, but, really showing us this attitude of not having any respect for this bird, let alone, thinking that it should be an emblem for this country. And I think this is a great quote to kind of summarize how raptors were viewed until, the mid 1900s. So this quote is a really great example of that. And continuing throughout the 1800s, raptors were seen as vermin. They were seen as cruel and pests due to their predatory nature. And at this time, most people would describe animals as they would describe other humans. So birds of prey were seen as amoral. One example of this, the photo on the right side of this page is taken as an illustration from a children's story that was published in 1857 called The Eagle's Nest. And it was a story about an eagle coming and kidnapping a human baby. And it really enforced a narrative of eagles being dangerous. And not only to, at this point, hunters and farmers were really aware of eagles' predatory nature, but now, the greater public had access to this kind of information. And that was really, damaging to the reputation of these birds. And then not only were we seeing this in children's story, but we're also seeing this in rhetoric or in legislative rhetoric. So in 1885, there was the Scalp Act enacted in Pennsylvania that put a 50-cent bounty on any birds of prey except for saw-whet owls, eastern screech owls, and barn owls. Because these animals weren't seen as big and scary as some of the other predators. They're not necessarily out there hunting poultry or potential game animals like ducks. And in about 18 months, the equivalent of $2.2 million today was spent on encouraging people to shoot hawks and owls. And in about 2 years over this time, 180,000 birds of prey were shot in just Pennsylvania. And so this really shows us that, within that legislative, they had this idea of good versus bad hawks. So kind of looking at the damage that these birds may do and seeing how, if they're helpful to the human economy or not. And it might be, obvious to think about people accept conservationists having these opinions, but unfortunately, that's not the case. So at the same time that this was going on, the Audubon Society was being created. And so in 1905, the first Audubon societies were created by women that were noticing that water birds were experiencing significant declines due to wanting their feathers for hats. And so at the same time that these birds were facing, gaining protections, birds of prey were continuing to be harped on, if you will. And so even conservationists held these attitudes. Dr. William Hornday founded the Permanent Wildlife Protection Fund, and he was known to think that any birds that kill useful birds, such as poultry, ducks, game birds, that kind of thing, should be persecuted. And he stated that all peregrine falcons look best in collections. And another really tough one to find out was John Muir. His, notions weren't as aggressive as Hornday's were, but in his 1913 autobiography, there's a scene that he recalls from his childhood of shooting down a hawk, unsure which species of hawk, that was eyeing up his chickens. And there was no inkling at all of any remorse in this retelling, which I found very interesting. And then it wasn't until about 1935 that we started to see, or the 1930s, that we started to see people starting to challenge this rhetoric of good versus bad hawks. So in 1935, Aldo Leopold joins the Audubon board and says that we're failing to see these birds as part of the land. So that's kind of the first time that people are recognizing that these birds could not only be potentially a big, a small part of an ecosystem, but crucial to the happenings of an ecosystem. Oh, hello. There we go. Okay, so these are some posters that I found. A lot of the resources that I got and a lot of the images I got are found on the Hawk Migration Association website. So there's lots of interesting stuff that you can find, but I thought that these were really interesting. So this is kind of reiterizing that idea of good versus bad hawks. So this is a real poster that they used to put out of trying to, distinguish between which birds you could shoot and which birds you can't. On the left, we see a duck hawk. If you look at the illustration, we can tell it's a peregrine falcon, but that was the nickname for them. So duck hawks were considered good birds at this point. I think they started to realize that peregrine falcons minded a little bit more of their business and weren't necessarily impacting farmers and poultry. Whereas on the right, we see the goshawks, which people have called chicken hawks for a long time. They love chickens. If you live anywhere with goshawks and chickens, it is a struggle. But yeah, this was a shocking find for me. So we just wanted to share that. So like I said, in the 1930s, this is when we started to see kind of a shift of rhetoric around birds and the good versus the bad. So in 1932, the Hawk and Owl Society was formed by Warren F. Eaton and some of other his friends, other people that were around him and cared about these things. And at this point, they put out a lot of newsletters with the Audubon Society for a couple years. They were only around for 1932 to 1935. But within these years, they put out a number of publications that push for protections of economically beneficial or harmless hawks. So protecting those good hawks again, but not necessarily the bad hawks. And then in 1934, this is if anyone saw my talk a couple years ago, I spent a lot of time talking about Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. But in 1934, an amazing woman named Rosalie Barrow Edge founded the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. And she was actually at a meeting with the Hawk and Owl Society, Audubon, and a couple other groups that all congregated in 1934. And she met a photographer that was telling her about the mass amounts of hawks that were being shot at Hawk Mountain due to the migratory behavior of this site. For those of you that don't know, Hawk Mountain is in Pennsylvania, and it was the first hawk watch ever founded in the United States, thanks to Rosalie. And so as this time goes on, and as hawk watches are being formed, and legislation is being put in to protect birds from hunting over the 40s and 50s, DDT starts to rise as well as in the 40s and 50s. So another thing that I found really shocking was that 1918, as some of us may know, was when the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was enacted, but it wasn't until 1972 that all hawks, eagles, and owls were included in this. So a lot of those birds originally were waterfowl, birds of those types. And yeah, it wasn't until the 70s that hawks and eagles and owls were included in this, which is a large period of time for them not to be included as they migrate. And then, yeah, so in the 40s and 50s through the 70s, DDT becomes a huge issue. This is something that is commonly known and a long-standing issue within raptor conservation. And we saw mostly birds that were hunting around waterways that were, high up in the trophic levels. So those apex predators, such as bald eagles and osprey, were really impacted. And DDT weakens eggshells, and we saw these great weakening and breaking of eggshells when birds would go to roost on their nest. And so in the 70s, we luckily enough were to recognize these issues and ban DDT in North America. And because of this banning, other pesticides were being produced. And there were, a number of other pesticides used in North America as well as in the wintering grounds of a lot of these birds. So Argentina, South America, Central America, Mexico. And a huge example of this is the Swainson's hawks. So I had always known that Swainson's hawks had a decrease in pesticide, or, a decrease in population due to pesticides. But it wasn't until recently that I learned that in the winter of 1995 to 1996, 6 to 20,000 Swainson's hawks were found dead or were reported dead just from that winter in their wintering grounds. And there are firsthand reports of animals or of birds dying almost immediately after being sprayed by these pesticides. So while in the United States, we were able to, put in these protections and monitor these birds and see increases in populations, we have this whole other aspect of their natural history of where they spend the winter, where they're migrating to, that we have to think about, and that, we're still continuing to fight for protections for these birds. So again, I apologize for how depressing this is. I promise that it gets a lot more promising, but I think it is really important to know just what these birds went through and what the challenges were, and especially the attitudes of people around raptors. Because while most of us, I would assume, are here because we, are in awe or whatever it may be, there's something about them that we find very fascinating. Most people found them very annoying and very problematic. Come on, there we go. Okay, so now we're getting into Dinosaur Ridge itself. But again, like I said, most of the hawk watches, Hawk Mountain was the first hawk watch founded in the United States. Following that was Cape May out in New Jersey, and then World War II happened. So most hawk watches and most raptor conservation programs were halted by the war. And so post World War II, we were able to start to see more of those formations. And by 1974, there were about 300 hawkwatchers that were interested in kind of collaborating across the country. And they formed what's now known, they're making their shift to Hawk Migration Association, but was previously known, and their website still says Hawk Migration Association of North America, or Humana. So that was established in 1974. And then Dinosaur Ridge as a site, that story begins with Steve Hoffman with the Western Foundation for Raptor Conservation, now known as Hawkwatch International. So Hawkwatch International today manages sites such as the Go Shoots in Nevada. They manage Manzano Mountains in New Mexico that I've worked at. They manage a site in Alaska, the Grand Canyon. They do a lot of Western sites. In 1976, Steve Hoffman and his friend established a site in the Wellsville Mountains of northern Utah, and that was the first site that they established. And 10 years later, they went on to form the organization now known as Hawkwatch International. And then in 1990, this organization contracted Dwayne Nelson to search for a Colorado migration site. So they'd established some around the West, but we're now focusing on Colorado. And Dwayne found Dinosaur Ridge on March 30th, 1990. Happy birthday to them. And he brought this information back to Hawkwatch International, and they did not want to continue pursuing this site because the numbers for migration were lower than some of the other sites that they were putting their focuses in. And so this information got kind of passed around in the telephone line to different, birders and hawkwatchers in Colorado. And so it went from Dwayne to a member of Denver field ornithologists, to a member of the Colorado Bird Observatory, then to Denver Museum of Natural History. So there's a lot of different players in the history of Dinosaur Ridge. This doesn't want to react the way I want it to. There we go. Okay. So in 1991 was the first year that anyone counted Dinosaur Ridge's site. It was a bit of a shortened year in terms of hours. There weren't nearly as many hours as there has been in some of the other seasons that we've counted. But the Colorado Bird Observatory, now known as Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, based mostly in Fort Collins, Colorado, and the Denver Museum of Natural History, now known as the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, created the Dinosaur Ridge Raptor Migration Station. So there was a lot of acronyms here. And in 1991 through 1998, this site was managed by mostly museum staff and volunteers. The museum put resources into improving trails to access the site. They developed what we now have as our platform, which is a nice flat piece of land at the top of this ridge so that we can have, as best viewing capabilities as we have. And they also developed some educational programs for both schools and the public. So public outreach to this day is something that's very important to us. And so it's cool to see that they started that out pretty quickly. And then in 1998 to 1999, the museum started to change focuses and just change priorities and what they were putting resources into. And then that led to Bird Conservancy of the Rockies taking over from 2000 to 2020. So that, 20-year span, it was mostly volunteer run. So there wasn't a full-time staff counter up there. There were different people up there every day. There were, not the strongest guidelines for how many hours people needed to be up there a day. It was kind of, we're using the resources that we have around us and trying not to run people dry, So that was a large period of time that BCR ran it. And then in 2020, the same thing kind of happened. Bird Conservancy of the Rockies decided that they were going to change their focus and focus more on some of their grassland bird programs. And Denver field ornithologists took over. So kind of circling back to one of the first of the telephone line. And then obviously 2020, COVID happened. So again, our count hours, the number of hours that we spent up there weren't as great as it has been. And in 2021, we were still kind of sorting out our volunteer program, and it was just volunteer run. And then 2022, the Hawkwatch Committee was created with Denver field ornithologists. And within that, they were able to source the funding to pay a full-time counter. And I was lucky enough to get that position. So in 2022, that was the first year in 22 years-ish, give or take, that they'd had a full-time paid counter. And I think that it's very apparent in the data, and I'll show you that soon. So let's see. Come on. I apologize. My laptop is being very slow in changing slides. There we go. Okay, so now we'll look at the data that we've got from Dinosaur Ridge. I'm going to get into some numbers here, and I'll try and make it as consumable as possible. So before 2023, we had access to data from 2000 to the present. And we always knew that there were these 10 years before 2000 that people were there and they counted. And in 2023, we were able to track down that data in the museum archives. And since then, that data has been input into hawkcount.org, which is where we store all of our data. So if any of you were here for the talk in 2022 that I gave, we didn't have access to that data, and now we do, which is really exciting. And an especially exciting year in 1999, in that kind of limbo between the museum and Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, data was collected by Jerry Ligori and Dakota Meshko. And if any of you are familiar with Jerry Ligori, if you've ever bought probably any raptor identification book, it was written by him. So Jerry Ligori unfortunately passed a few years ago, but he was, many people called him the father or grandfather of hawkwatching. He is the source of so many of our guidebooks, the guidebooks that I use today, all different apps and resources. And it's really special for our site to have been counted by Jerry Ligori. Unfortunately, that data, we only have the season totals, so we can't officially enter that data into Hawk Count. But we do have that data. If you'd like to see the season totals, that's on our Hawk Count page. And I'm going to be sharing kind of a list of resources at the end of this. You guys can get all of that. And it's really interesting to see. So that was kind of a weird year then. And then obviously, as I said previously, 2000 to 2021, essentially, we had a lot of inconsistency in count hours. And that's a lot of times we look at the number of hours counted per season to kind of see, that's our base level of if the data is of quality. And I'll get into that in just a second. But in that 21 year time frame, 22 years, we averaged about 326 hours of counting and as low as 82 hours in 2009. And for example, in the last three years, we've averaged about 450. So we can see, this really great difference in count hours. And then why we care about count hours and why, it matters for that data consistency are the raptor population indexes. So these are analysis put together. It's kind of a collaboration between Hawkwatch International, Hawk Migration Association, a number of these different places that all come together and report their data. And every 3 years and every 10 years put out reports. And this is kind of how a lot of biologists can make inference decisions on conservation and how we can monitor these populations long term. And so the Hawk Migration Association recommends daily counts covering 95% of the day's migration period. So whether that's 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., if that's, when we're seeing most of our migration, 95% of that needs to be covered. And as I said previously, that 2000 to 2021 period, we had a lot of variation. And so because of that, those years of data weren't able to be used in the 10-year analysis that the raptor population index has done, which is disappointing. But now that we have kind of gotten Dinosaur Ridge under the Hawkwatch committee, we can look forward to being included in some of that. And so this is just a quick graph that I put together to look at count hours. So this blue line right here represents count hours. And I broke up the data into these kind of 3 time periods that I've been referencing. So the first period being when the museum was running it and we had a staffed counter and volunteers. The second period being when it was primarily volunteer run. And the third being since Denver field ornithologist has been able to hire a full-time counter. And so we can see that the count hours are decreased on average in that middle chunk, as well as, if we look at this gray line represents red-tailed hawk averages for that time period. The green is the turkey vultures and the yellow is the American kestrels. So we can really see that relationship between population and count hours. And we're going to see that continuing on. So the next graphs that I will share, hopefully. I apologize. I'm also in a hotel, not because of a leak, but my Wi-Fi is a little spotty. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So these are actually the raptor population indexes that were put together by RPI. And this is including data up until 2023. So we can see here that this data is, from the early 2000s up until 2023. And we can see that same, let me see if I can get that out of the way. Great. I don't know. Okay, maybe that, whatever. We can see that, we're following that same trend in the mid 2000s to 2020 with things declining. So that trend is pretty obvious to us. But another thing that we need to be looking at, and another thing of importance in these graphs, is this slope number. So the slope with broad-winged hawk 1.72, a slope above 0 tells us that the population is increasing. So this is really interesting. We can look at the population, and this is just for Dinosaur Ridge. This is just based off of Dinosaur Ridge data, which is really exciting for us to have. But I was able to look at, I've got 4 species that we're going to look at these graphs for, just to get a decent idea of how this data is looking. And then RPI also puts out these species assessments. And so they look at each of the species that I'm presenting, and they tell us in North America as a whole, as well as Western, Eastern regions, if they're staying stable, increasing, or decreasing. And so despite, these kind of inconsistencies in our data for quite a large chunk of time, we are able to see that through the RPI species assessment, the broad-winged hawk is showing as stable or increasing across North American sites. So with that positive slope that we're seeing, that increase in population, regardless of that data inconsistency, that's aligning up with the grand North America species assessment for broad-winged hawk, which is nice to see. The Ferruginous hawk, this guy's a special one to our site. As Taiki mentioned in the beginning, that was kind of the first hawk I studied, so I'm super partial to them. But we are one of the only sites that count them, and we are also the #1 site we hold the highest record for Ferruginous hawks ever counted. And I'll get to those numbers in just a second, but these birds are very special to us. Unfortunately, you see the slope. We're seeing a decline in that, but again, we have to take all of these with a grain of salt with those inconsistent data. So we're seeing that through the species assessment, the Ferruginous hawks are staying stable, but there's only one other site that's counting them, and that's the Ghost Chutes in Nevada. So unfortunately, the Dinosaur Ridge data wasn't included in the species assessment. So we can look at the Ferruginous hawk numbers that we've got in front of us and hope that that decline is actually just a representation of the count hours. And actually, I learned today that Ferruginous hawk nesting data has been proven very important and very successful in representing population numbers. And that nesting data has also shown this pretty significant, if we look at the end of this graph over the last year since 2020, we're seeing a great increase in numbers. And that is also backed up by the nesting data that we've found for the Western sites, which is really exciting. So hopefully, one of those data fallacies that we can, as we continue to count over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we can kind of even that out and look at how things actually look. And then the other 2 birds I wanted to touch on, the Swainson's hawk. Again, I talked about the pesticides with them, so I wanted to see how they were doing. And then the red-tailed hawk, everyone's favorite. So again, the Swainson's hawk, that slope is just over 0. So that tells us that they're increasing, which is very exciting, especially knowing that they had such a decline in population not too long ago, relatively. And then the red-tailed hawk, we see some crazy things going on. And the red-tailed hawk is, a species of interest to a lot of biologists. It's one of the main numbers, main species seen at sites. It makes up a large majority of our data. And, we're seeing a pretty below zero slope, a pretty negative slope on that, which is concerning. But then when we look at the RPI species assessment, they're seeing about a 50-50 spread in populations staying stable and populations decreasing. And when we look at that regionally, the majority of the populations decreasing are in the east. And so, again, is our data representation a true representation of the population? Most likely not, because we've got these inconsistencies in data and in count hours. So this is, again, a species that will be really important for us to continue to monitor and see how not only our site reflects their movements, but other sites. And this is one species in particular that their migratory patterns are always changing and they're always adapting to new environments. So it will be interesting to see what they do over the next few years. So just to kind of look at what is going on with this data. As I've touched on a lot, the data collection variations through count hours we believe to be our largest driver for the trends that we're seeing. And then outside of that, outside of having lowered numbers, because we're having such inconsistencies in who's up there day to day in that 2000 to 2021 period, the subjectivities of identification, of when they want to be there, of all of these things come into play. And that can really impact data consistency as well. And then another factor that could be playing into it, as I touched with the red tails, is migration paths are shifting. And we have seen this, as well as migration timing, with, a changing climate, with land changing. There's always different things going on. So birds, with the California wildfires a couple of years ago, sites more eastern, we're seeing a lot of those birds coming through as opposed to going through those sites. When there's droughts, we can see birds shifting east to west. It's, some species will have more of eruptive years, so that will come more south some years than they will other years. But as a whole, there's the hypothesis or this question of, are birds coming less south or further north, or what are they doing with their wintering and their breeding grounds? And are we seeing decreased numbers because they're not here or because they're not anywhere, to avoid being super morbid? And then again, there's always going to be not always, hopefully, but right now there's other issues that face raptor conservation. A large one, especially in the West, is lead poisoning. Hunting with lead bullets, they can fragment very easily, and especially scavengers, so golden eagles, vultures, bald eagles, those kind of birds, California condors, can see pretty significant impacts on their population, especially localized populations due to lead poisoning. Land changes, like I mentioned, in northern Arizona, there's some trees taking over other trees, shrubland becoming forested, whether that's assisted or just due to climate change. And then a big thing that we all think about is urbanization. So, human impact, humans moving into places, wind turbines, all of these things. And some birds, like the red-tailed hawk and the Cooper's hawk and some other birds, we see adapting really well to urbanization. And some birds we see not adapting really well. And those, we still have a lot of questions around that. Okay, and then for some fun highlights of Dinosaur Ridge. So like I said, I've been counting this site since 2022. And since then, we've had the highest counts of Ferruginous Hawks since the record year in 1997. The record year, I was born in 1997, and that's the record year. And I think that's really beautiful and exciting. So fun to note for me. But since then, in 2023 and 2022, we had 65 and 63 birds respectively. And the only other year that was that close or, above the 50s were all before 1997. So it's been a long time since we've seen those high numbers. As a whole of total population, we've seen the highest counts since 2005. So we're averaging about 2,300 birds per season. And then also when we're collecting this data, we're always noting if we see a raptor that we can't fully identify, whether we know it's a falcon, but I don't know if it's a peregrine versus a prairie falcon, or I just saw a big bird fly by. I'm pretty sure it's a raptor, but I know nothing else. And since 2022, the last 3 years, the unknown counts of those species have, or those categories have been decreased since the previous, which is, I've had bosses tell me if I don't have any unknown data that they don't believe me, and I fully stand by that. You're never going to know everything, but being able to count with as highest accuracy as you can is only beneficial to the data. And then just a couple other species that are of note. So the broad-winged hawk is famously known to come in mass in the eastern part of the United States. And in the western part of the United States, we really only see them in migration. And they're, they're here for a couple weeks and then they're gone. But they're a real gift to us at Dinosaur Ridge. We get people from all over the state coming out to see them when it's peak broad-winged hawk season. And the last 2 years are our second and third highest counts ever, which is really exciting to see that these birds are doing really well. And then the Swainson's hawk, as I've been mentioning tonight, they have been coming back really well. And so in 2023, we had the highest count in season history of 77 Swainson's hawks. Comparatively to some other sites, our numbers aren't the biggest that could be possible, but 77 is great for us. And as I said, a record for us. And within those, we see a high majority of dark morphs. So that's another really exciting thing about this site in comparison to other sites across the country. We see a high number of dark morph Swainsons, Ferruginous hawks, red-tailed hawks, and even broad-winged hawks. So I've seen a dark morph broad-winged hawk every year that I have been at Dinosaur Ridge, and one year we counted about 50. So it's pretty impressive. And, there's a lot of really cool things happening at that site. There we go. Okay, so just to kind of start to wrap things up, I went over some of the history of Dinosaur Ridge and, what we're looking at now. And we're seeing that these trends are increasing since we've been able to standardize the count hours. And, we've got a lot to look forward to. So in the next couple of years, being able to continue to participate in these analysis and be able to really use our data across the country to inform conservation decisions. So our site, our season runs from March 1st to May 10th. It's, like I said, about a half a mile hike up to the top of Dinosaur Ridge from a parking lot. We don't have any facilities up there, unfortunately, but it's a beautiful view. And we have daily volunteer shifts that we like to get filled. So while we have counters, myself, another one of our counters for the season, we also have weekend observers that are college students that are excited to learn, which I think is really great. We also really heavily rely on volunteers, especially in our peak season. We can have 10, 20, 30 birds flying at a time. And when there's only 2 people trying to figure it out, it feels like our heads have been cut off. So we really, really appreciate volunteers. And I think that, we've had a lot of volunteers come back and say that they've learned something new every year. And even when they're not learning something new, that they're still getting to see something really amazing. So those volunteer shifts up at the Ridge are about 4 hours every day. We do them twice a day. And as a volunteer, you can come once, you can come weekly. If you're going to volunteer, we do ask to try and have a, consistent schedule, but we are always looking for visitors. So, you can come once, you can come up every day to volunteer, but this site is a really special place. And I think that, as you can see, it's got a lot of potential for it to be, a statistically important site, and it already is. We've been contacted by Hawk Migration Association to be asked to continue running as a site due to our importance with Ferruginous hawks and prairie falcons. We're the only site in the spring that counts those. I could go on forever about why Dinosaur Ridge is a special site, but I will leave you with this. So We have two training sessions for the season. If you would like to, just kind of take a peek at what raptor identification looks like. If you've got a ton of experience, if you've got no experience, um, we have an online Zoom meeting with Dave Hill, who is a previous president of Denver Field Ornithologists. He's a great resource. Wednesday, February 19th from 7 to 8:30. He's going to do a really nice overview of raptor identification. One main thing of hawk watching is that raptor identification in flight is a completely different beast from raptor identification perched or, on nest or whatever it may be. And any information that we can get to help us with that is helpful, super crucial. So that's going to be a great resource. And then if you think that you would be interested in volunteering with us, you can contact us at dinosaurridgehawkwatch.org. I will send this information out. But we've just got a volunteer sign up page, and we'll have our on-site orientation for hawk watching at 10 to 1 p.m. on February 22nd. And again, we've got this capacity at 24. So if that's something that's interesting to you, you can reach out to me. I can get you in touch with them, or yeah, you can go on that dinosaurridgehawkwatch.org, our brand new and improved website, and get signed up. And thank you for having me. I appreciate you guys all listening. I really am excited to hear your questions. Yeah, thank you all.
Wow. Incredible. Certainly
Hopefully
got,
not too morbid.
I got wrapped up in the morbidity. It was
Yeah,
incredible.
it's shocking.
People got to know,
Yeah.
birds don't bird like they used to.
Thanks, Saiki. Okay, let me see. I'm gonna stop screen sharing.
So
Cool.
yes, you do have a few questions in the chat. I don't think it needs to be ordered,
Beautiful.
but you can certainly get started wherever you feel
Oh,
necessary. Ajit
sweet.
has the beginning question from Seth.
Yes. Hi, Ajit. Yeah, so Ajit brings up a great word in the chat. I don't know if you guys can all access this, but anthropomorphizing is the term used to describe people using human describers for animals. So calling them amoral. It's a pretty outdated practice, but still something that we do see, unfortunately. But yeah, it took a long time for people to ever make the difference, make the
Mhm.
make the distinction.
Right. And I want to add too, one of the ways that you see it, but everyone tolerates it, is nature documentaries. Where
Yeah.
they play the sad music when the thing
Yeah.
hits.
Or dog adoption. And I've got a dog and I adopted her. But yeah,
Right.
a lot of
It,
those things where um
in society, like it's not
yeah,
it's totally happening now, just in this really evolved and sophisticated sounding way.
totally. And people want to make sense of things that they don't understand, and they're
Sure.
going to use the resources that they have,
Absolutely.
at their mercy. But yeah, it was super detrimental for a very long time. Okay, so let's see. Okay, G, next question. Yep. Are the red tails not migrating as they used to, but being non-migrating? That may explain the reduced numbers. So yeah, that's a great point. And especially with red-tailed hawks, as they become, these guys are really considered generalists in the world of raptors. A lot of species, osprey are really specialists. So they're just looking to hunt fish primarily. Red-tailed hawks, they'll eat anything that they can get their talons on, and they're really hardy. They can withstand some pretty extreme temperatures. All birds can, but red tails are just seem a bit more tolerant of it. So there's a huge possibility that they're not migrating, or they're doing a lot more of local migration. So whether that's migrating from lower elevation in the summer to higher, no, lower elevation in the winter to higher elevation in the summer, or just making a very small migration of tens, 50s, hundreds of miles, versus these grand things are totally a possibility.
And to add to that question, could you share your perspective about red tails being generalist when some of the factors that affect their migratory behaviors include urbanization and development?
Yeah, yeah. So red tails are one of the birds that, if I'm sure many of you have noticed that, they will be everywhere. I see them driving along I-25. I see them, on a light pole outside of a school. They'll be standing in a road. Then they'll also be in the middle of nowhere in a lot of these great agricultural spaces. And so for them to adapt to, they're broadening the circumstances in which they can survive and in which they can thrive. So instead of, needing just a couple species to live off of and these certain environmental conditions, they're really adapting to eat more, a broader spectrum of prey items and tolerate different environmental conditions. So in a place that, say, for example, Denver, you've got this grand urbanization. The urbanization may not have a huge impact on where they're moving, but the weather and the climate of Denver might. If that makes sense. All right. The next question Angela asks about, the avian flu. Could the avian flu be another factor that might influence trends? Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that might be more evident in years to come. So especially with migration, because this is kind of more of a passive data collection, we're not going out to nesting sites. This project isn't going out to nesting sites and trying to collect as much data as we possibly can on one species, but we're sticking by a protocol that's been developed and run for 20, 30 years. It's a bit harder for us to pick up on those immediate changes. And so, that might be something that we see in future years. But definitely a possibility. Definitely a possibility. Yeah. If you look across Denver and the Front Range, we see reports of birds of prey, falling ill and dying due to avian influenza. So it's still a concern. It's still something they're running rampant. I haven't been able to find eggs in weeks in Fort Collins. So it's definitely still an issue.
I'm still getting my eggs at Costco.
Smart.
So if you need the card, I can.
Thank you. Yeah, just a biologist. Okay, cool. Yeah, someone asked what are dark morphs. It looks like a couple people have gotten to that response, but when we think of a red-tailed hawk, we think of they're kind of white underwing and they've got the commas on their wrist and the white, the belly band, and then these birds can also come all completely dark underneath in various shades of like a brown or a red. And then Swainson's hawks can come completely dark underneath and a different shade of brown. And then Ferruginous with the same thing. And so you get all of these coloring, which is something we try not to rely on in hawk watching identification as much as we can, goes completely out of the window with those. And you're really having to look at flight patterns and proportions of the birds, the way that the silhouette is. And so it's really cool because we get to see some really unique things, but it's also a fun challenge, I'd say. But yeah, dark morph species are across the board not as common as their light morph counterparts. I think across North America, at least. I can't speak for the rest of the world, but they're a treat. And in the West, the percentage of dark morph species is much greater than in the East.
A dark morph we also may all be familiar with is watching our bananas turn from yellow to brown.
Absolutely. That's a brilliant comparison. Absolutely. Yeah. And then I had another question. Do you see any rough-legged hawks in your spring count window? So this is one of our tricky guys. So in the 3 years that I've been there, the first year I counted in 2022, we counted 3, and they were all within March. I think one of them might have been end of March. It wasn't the first couple days by any means. Since then, we've counted none. I think last winter, subjectively, people in the Front Range area were reporting seeing less rough-legged hawks. But that species in particular is what we call an eruptive species. So one year, they're always going to go back to their wintering habitat. They winter up they breed up in the Canadian Arctic. So they've got fuzzy legs. They can really withstand some cold temperatures. And then in the winter, depending on how cold it gets and how much prey is available in those breeding grounds will dictate how far south they come. And so, a lot of northern species like great gray owls, snowy owls are a really good example of these things. Some of these other birds that are really Arctic heavy will only come south, as far south as they have to find prey and then go back up north. And so rough-legged hawks not being at the site consistently isn't a huge concern of ours, but it is frustrating because we want to see them because we like them. But it's a never say never situation, and so we're hoping that we'll see some more there. But yeah, the last 2 years we haven't had any.
Mm.
And then interesting, as you just taught me something as well. It says that rough-legged dark morphs are more common in the east. So that's an example of we don't get enough rough-leggeds to even pick up on that trend right now. But as many of you may know, we get them wintering in the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. We see them in the eastern part of Colorado all the time. And so, it's a question of, are they not coming down as far south every year, or are they taking more of an eastern line? We have those questions for a lot of species that we see these variations. And so, a large majority of why it's so important for us to continue funding a counter first and foremost, and continuing the kind of efforts to increase the efforts at Dinosaur Ridge and not trying to avoid another passing of the torch and having inconsistencies in the data, is that we can actually really look at our data as a whole and get a real image of what's going on. But again, we've got a lot of resources from other sites in North America and other sites in the West that can really support us in our understanding of our data as it is.
Excellent.
Yes. And then one other species that we're hoping to see, we haven't seen any of, but some of you may know that the Mississippi kites have started to breed in Colorado. I don't know if you are familiar with, if you knew that, Takey. You said you're
Yeah,
new.
yeah, yeah. I'm new here.
So
Wow.
Rocky Mountain Arsenal and the southern part of the state, there have been reports of Mississippi kites nesting. And we think that if we're going to get one of those, it's going to be the end of the season. But every year, the last week, we are fingers crossed for a Mississippi kite. So it's one of those sites that even if it is a slow day, I always find something wild happens, something amazing happens. And so one of these slow days, we're going to get a Mississippi kite.
And that's the beautiful thing about birding. You go
Yeah.
out open-minded, empty cup, and the
Yeah.
adventure fills it up.
Yeah. Yeah. And this site, I've counted a couple other sites and I'm obviously super biased, but I think that it's a site that really rewards you for the time that you put in. And even though we don't have the insane numbers that some other sites in North America does, that we get rewarded for it in really amazing looks at birds. And I've seen a dark morph broadwing fly underneath me, which is just like a look you never get to see of a bird. And there's a really great atmosphere up there and a really great group of people that run it, in my opinion. I like my boss.
Excellent. And I'm glad you shared information about opportunities to volunteer, to visit, and to see the birds, help out with the importance of bird conservation because, 30, 50, 80 years from now, they're going to be talking about what we were doing in the 2020s. They're
Yeah.
like, all of these things were going on, and they still found a way to protect birds.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow,
They
look at
still found
us.
themselves counting birds on a mountain. And I think it is good for us.
Yeah, look
So
at us go.
yeah. But yeah, like I said, I will get some of this information out to CFO so they can spread it. But I'll get the link of our Hawkwatch site